Hello, welcome to Focus 15 Spanish. I'm the Spanish grammar guy. I'm here to help you with all things Spanish grammar. So let's get straight into it today. We're going to look today at the present subjunctive in subordinate clauses. What? Subordinate what? I'll explain. Don't worry. So first of all, the subjunctive is a mood in Spanish, which is why it's often difficult for non-native Spanish speakers to get to grips with it, especially English speakers. We don't use the subjunctive much in English anymore, but it's a mood. And there are three moods in Spanish: the indicative mood, the imperative, and the subjunctive. And the subjunctive has four tenses: the present, the imperfect, the perfect, and the pluperfect. But today I'm just going to look at the present subjunctive in certain situations when the subjunctive is most frequently used, and that's in subordinate clauses introduced by that little word que. Okay, subordinate what? Subordinate clauses. Very quick explanation. It's a useful explanation because the subjunctive often appears in these clauses. So a subordinate clause is just part of a sentence. Sentences are made up of different parts or clauses that have a verb and a subject. And there's usually a main part to a sentence and a subordinate part that adds extra information. Let's have a look at an example, very simple example. Voy al supermercado. I'm going to the supermarket. Now, this is a main clause, there's a verb and a subject. Let's add another part of the sentence to add information, a subordinate clause. Voy al supermercado porque quiero comprar chocolate. So we see that the subordinate clause is just adding information to the main clause. Now in this case, there's no subjunctive, but often the subordinate clause does need the subjunctive, depending on only two things. Yes, only two, so it's not difficult to remember when we need to use the subjunctive. So what are those two things? Firstly, the nature of the main verb, the verb in the main clause. What type of verb is it? We'll get to that in a second. And secondly, the other factor determining the presence of the subjunctive is that the subject of the main verb in the main clause and the subject of the verb in the subordinate clause are different. They're the two things that determine whether or not you're going to need the subjunctive in these clauses. Let's have a look at an example. El profesor quiere que los estudiantes hagan los deberes. The teacher wants the students to do their homework. So the verb in the main clause here is querer. What type of verb is querer? It's a verb of wishing, wanting, desiring. And yes, it is one of the verbs that requires the subjunctive. Other types of verbs that require the subjunctive in subordinate clauses are, for example, verbs of possibility, impossibility, doubt or uncertainty, permission, prohibition, acceptance, agreement, orders or commands, hopes, requests, wishes, needs and requirements, emotions, recommendations, advice and suggestions, and even verbs of thinking when they are in the negative. Okay, yes, there are lots. I can't list all the verbs here, but whenever you see or want to use a verb that wants to express one of these things, then if you are using a subordinate clause, you may need a subjunctive. So that's the first reason why the subjunctive might be needed, the nature of the main verb. What type of verb is it? What about the next reason? Well, the next reason is if the subject of the verb in the main clause is different from the subject of the verb in the subordinate clause. Let's go back to the example. El profesor quiere que los estudiantes hagan los deberes. So the subject in the main clause is el profesor, while the subject in the subordinate clause is los estudiantes. They are different subjects. So as the verb is also one that might require the subjunctive, then we need to use the subjunctive in the subordinate clause, so the verb becomes hagan, which is the subjunctive of the verb hacer, to do. Okay, so you just follow these two rules in order to use the subjunctive. Let's have a look at more examples. Let's take, for example, a verb of emotion. And let's have a sentence in English. Here we are. I'm glad you called. A simple sentence. But in Spanish, we have a verb of emotion spoken by one subject, yo. Let's put that in. Me alegro de. Then we need a subordinate clause with a different subject, tú. And so because the verb is one that requires the subjunctive, a verb of emotion, we're going to need to use the subjunctive in the second part of the sentence. So it becomes me alegro de que me llames. Yes, Spanish would use the present tense here, not the past as in the English. Okay? So even in simple sentences, the subjunctive may be used. What about this example? I'm afraid it's true. Again, it's a verb of emotion. I am afraid, of fear, with the subject yo. So that becomes temo, I'm afraid. Then we add the subordinate clause, which has a different subject, in this case, it. Because we're using a verb of emotion, we need the subjunctive. So it becomes temo que sea verdad. Okay. So it's simple when we have to follow just those two rules. Let's now take a look at how the subjunctive is formed for regular verbs. And we'll take AR verb, ER and IR verbs. So let's have a look at llamar for AR verbs. These are regular verbs. And the subjunctive in the present becomes llame, llames, llame, llamemos, llaméis, llamen. Okay, let's take ER verbs. Comer becomes coma, comas, coma, comamos, comáis, coman. And for IR verbs, let's take vivir, viva, vivas, viva, vivamos, viváis, vivan. They're the endings for the present subjunctive for regular verbs. And of course, there are lots of irregular verbs, but I'm afraid you'll just have to find these out as you go along, look them up. Okay, that's it now for the use of the subjunctive in subordinate clauses. Follow those two rules and you can't go wrong. There are lots of other types of sentences that also use the subjunctive, not just in subordinate clauses, but these are covered in other videos. Just search for the Spanish Grammar Guy on Focus 15 Spanish on YouTube. Okay, thanks for watching and see you next time.